Hi, everybody. I'm Martin Pusic, and welcome to the second of our series on the Master Adaptive Learner brought to you by the Brigham Educational Institute. And what we're doing here is talking about a conceptual model that a whole group of us put together under the auspices of the American Medical Association. And so this model is meant to be a shared language across health professions education, really, whether you're a medical student or on the first day before your retirement. All the way along, learning is an important part of being an effective clinician, and this model tries to support that. And so in this session, we're going to just briefly review what we went through in the first session on the overview of the Master Adaptive Learner and adaptive expertise in particular. And then we're going to concentrate on learning for adaptive expertise, the first couple of phases within the model. And so over the next three sessions, we'll go through the whole model, the planning, learning, assessing, and adjusting phases. But today's session is about specifically learning, and then we're going to touch on planning. All of this is detailed in the American Medical Association's book on the Master Adaptive Learner, and this represents the crystallization of the work of this subgroup within the American Medical Association. And to review it, remember each of the Master Adaptive Learner words has resonance with what it's trying to bring across. And so that I mentioned that we feel that learning is part of the core identity of a clinician, and that as the world changes more and more rapidly, that the imperative to learn on the job is going to go from a nice to have to a need to have. And indeed, during this COVID pandemic, we've seen really to an extreme extent how much we've had to learn in a very, very short time. And the Master Adaptive Learner model puts an emphasis on exactly that kind of learning on the fly and adaptation. And so last time we talked about adaptive expertise, where we can innovate in the moment and discern exactly the right level of innovation versus routine care. And then finally, mastery. It's not good enough to just have these skills emerge. We need to be intentional, and we need to be able to set standards and say what it is to be a master adaptive learner, and we'll get into that as well. The Master Adaptive Learner models summarized in a graphic that the American Medical Association put together, and we'll go through these four wheels that you see on the left there. And again, this is modeled on the PDSA cycle, the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle that you may know of from the quality improvement world, where the four phases are plan, learn, assess, and adjust. And these four phases are modified by coaching, which we think is a very, very important part and a very important support for learning by clinicians, as well as what are portrayed as batteries here. And basically the idea is that important elements are curiosity, motivation, mindset, and resilience, all qualities and all traits that are important to being an effective clinician and an effective learner. The Dreyfus brothers put together a model of expertise development, and that model is predicated on how much supervision you need, mainly. And it starts off where you're a novice, you're not allowed to practice at all, and you need complete supervision, all the way up to an expert who not only does not require supervision, but supervises others. And what we've tried to articulate is an extension to this model in which you don't just finish and become an automatic expert. Instead, you aim for adaptive expertise in which whatever the situation is, you can adapt, but also even in a static situation, you work at getting better and better and better through time, so that the work of perfecting your abilities as a clinician never ends. And to that end, the Master Adaptive Learner model tries to give us the processes, theories, and techniques that allow us to continue improving on into time. And again, we're going to focus on these four wheels, these four phases, and specifically the two first phases of planning and learning. And let's go right into the learning phase of the Master Adaptive Learner model. Now, what's kind of ironic is that by the time you're in your health profession school, whether it's medical school, nursing school, or other, you've been successful. You got into a competitive program and have demonstrated on various hoops and examinations and the like that you can learn. And so what's a bit tricky within this model is teaching these really, really, really good learners that they indeed should learn in a different way. And so that's the overarching message here is that no matter how good you've been to date, you can be even better. And some of the learning that you've done to date, and it's partly the fault of our educational structures, isn't the appropriate kind of learning that will benefit you as a clinician. So those are the things I'm going to try and tackle in the next little bit. And so learning under the Master Adaptive Learner model is defined as a period of intense focus in which the student or learner wrestles with internalizing her new understandings that address an identified gap in knowledge, skills, or attitudes. And the thing that I'm going to highlight there is the idea that you wrestle and that you have to internalize these new understandings and make for lasting change. And the key elements that we identified as a group around this are the ability to think critically, the ability to use evidence in learning. We've gotten good at evidence-based practice in which we use the best research evidence to guide our practice. Well, there's a lot of evidence in the science of learning that we can use to guide learning. And that's evidenced by the science of learning, and more we're incorporating that into the health professions. I'm going to work on these four things and about learning, and I've chosen them because they're kind of non-standard. They're the different ways of making us think differently about learning, and it's what we'd like to bring across in terms of becoming expert learners. So let's start with the first one, which is that learning is not linear. And here's a typical learning curve, and anytime you see a learning curve, it's S-shaped. It's not a straight line, even though we carry with us a straight line conceptualization of learning. If I put in X number of hours, I learn Y amount. And so that middle zone on this slide, where it looks linear from the bottom arrow on the left and the top arrow on the right, is what feels like learning. And so that every bit that I invest, I get better. The thing is that what that ignores is the fact that the very best of learning and the very apex of expertise that we're trying to instill in each of our learners doesn't happen in the middle of the learning curve. Instead, real expertise happens on the far right there after an inflection point. And real expertise, you put in a lot of effort in order to get a small amount of benefit in terms of that expertise. And so what distinguishes a true expert from a person who has just done the minimum is that they keep working at it. And they keep working at it in the face of a long, arduous journey to full expertise. And so I like to tell the anecdote of myself when I was a senior resident, in pediatrics. I felt like I had developed expertise because I had developed so much from when I entered residency and in first year and second year. And first year and second year, it felt like each week I was getting better and really, really fast. But what it was I was on the fast part of this slope. So on the learning the things that are easier to learn, and it feels good to learn those things, and you learn rapidly. And it does feel linear in that each bit of effort you get a lot more. But you shouldn't confuse the slowing in the learning rate, that inflection point in the middle there, with actual expertise, because all that's happened is that you've learned the easy things, and now the next thing to learn is harder to learn. It's rare, it's subtle, it's hard to grasp. It's people disagree about what the best thing to do is. All of those sorts of nuances, all that gray stuff that distinguishes the true expert is now starting to be the thing that learns, that you have to learn. And now you have to really, really put in effort, and it's much more effortful to learn that stuff. And yet the journey to expertise has barely begun. And so in saying that learning is nonlinear, what I think our systems need to do is they need to get off of this idea of linear learning, that I put in X amount and I automatically get out Y learning, to the idea that a true expert is in the area of what Anders Ericsson calls the law of diminishing returns. And so that in that I have to put in more and more effort in order to get to the end of the expertise curve. And so if we think again in terms of the Dreyfus and Dreyfus model, what this suggests is that the adaptive expert is the person who keeps on putting more effort in, even when it's not as satisfying and it's not as clear that you're learning, but having faith that in fact you are. The second non-intuitive thing about learning as a clinician is that learning is ideally difficult. So let's do a bit of a mind exercise. On the slide, it says the proposed length of paternity leave in Finland is blank days. I want you to think right now and give me your guesstimate as to what the duration of paternity leave is in Finland. Give you 5 seconds, come up with a number. Okay, have you got your number? You're all set? Great. Now, the standard way to teach this is to go, the proposed length of paternity leave in Finland is X days, and give the actual answer. But if I hide the answer from you, if I force you to guess, if I force you to commit to a number, if I force you to write that number down, or worse yet, say it out loud in front of everybody else, it gets your juices flowing. It also makes you think about each of the aspects of this particular claim. Why did he choose paternity leave and not maternity leave or parental leave? There must be something different about paternity leave. And so that now I have to rub paternity against maternity against paternal. And Finland, why Finland? Okay, that socialist country way up there in Scandinavia, okay, they're different in terms of what they do. So it's probably going to be longer than what we do here. And so that, and what we do here may not be great. So all sorts of thoughts start to crowd each of our brains in order to worry about generating this number. Contrast that with me giving you a factoid where I just lay out the fact that the number is 163 days. And so that struggle that you went through in terms of that is what's called a desirable difficulty. And these desirable difficulties that get us cogitating, that get us working, that get us actively learning, result in far better retention and far more solid knowledge structures within our brains than the kind of passive learning that we used to do in terms of highlighting in yellow ink in textbooks or just reading. And so test-enhanced learning, in which you have to do flashcards where you don't know the answer and you have to struggle with the answer, is much, much more effective. And this research has really been put forth by the Elizabeth and Robert Bjork out of UCLA, as well as and I've included a reference to Rohrer and Paschler, which is another excellent description about surprising ways that where learning is effective that you wouldn't have thought of it that way. And so again, in terms of this learning curve, that linear part where it all seems sort of straightforward, the idea is to make that actually harder so that you struggle within that phase, as opposed to just coasting along. And so this is taken from an article on the Finnish paternity leave idea, and sort of in terms of the 164 days. Feel free to read about it there. But again, I just use it as an example of being able to convert things to active learning. The more relevant example to us in the health professions is what we talked about in the last session, adaptive expertise. And so if we learn for efficiency and try and routinize what we're trying to learn in terms of clinical care, that's perhaps the easier way. So that you strip the variability out of practice in order to develop polished routines down there on the bottom right in terms of efficiency. Whereas what's a good, desirable difficulty in health professions education is to not allow the learner to routinize their care, but instead to always question, to always try to innovate, to put them in quality improvement situations, to have them give talks on the controversies of the particular type of care, to have them do research projects in which they have to question why things are done the way they are. And so to place the learner in the learning for adaptability zone where they have to rub innovation against routinization, it's harder in the short term, but in the long term, it engenders those adaptive expertise muscles and allows them to become true adaptive experts as clinicians. So the third non-particularly intuitive thing about learning is that the best learning is more about later and less about now. So I've got a quote here from the well-known actress Laura Dern, in which she answers the question, what was the decision that changed your life? And she answers this way: I think it was early on, choosing to work for filmmakers as my education. And that meant making short-term sacrifices, taking very little money, and taking 3 scenes in a movie for famous director Peter Bogdanovich versus the probably more celebrated lead in a Brat Pack movie. In the 80s, other people became famous very quickly, but I look back on my career and it was such a sublime moment of saying, I'm here to learn, I'm here to grow, I'm here to work with the auteurs and be of service to the story, whatever part I am. So subsuming herself in return for learning with the very best instead of the superficial fast part of your learning curve. And what that means is that I talked about the middle of the learning curve and that linear part that feels so good when we're learning, and I talked about the right hand part of the learning curve, that asymptotic becoming expert slowly in the mastery side. Now we're talking about the first third of the learning curve, the part at the beginning where you really don't know what's going on and you haven't organized yourself well enough in order to get into the fast slope of the learning curve. And that phase is really, really important. And that's where you need a lot of help. You need coaching. You need instructors to tell you what's happening. You need people to lay down railroad tracks that will allow you to really take off when the time comes. And a solid initial grounding will help you tremendously in terms of moving forward, as opposed to bad habits learned early that end up propagating throughout your career. My classic example for this is that there's a strong argument to be made for problem-based learning, which is inherently really, really inefficient at the beginning, but it teaches you to and creates a frame for approaching clinical problems that is perhaps more accurate than some of the less stable structures of learning that are lecture-based or factoid-based. So how you start off is important. And to show you that in terms of the way we perhaps incorrectly set up our curricular structures. Here at the top, I've got two people learning, blue and green, and they learn during a particular phase, and then where the dot is, there's an exam. And so the person in green writes the exam, and the person in blue writes the exam, and in the immediate exam they answer as best they can, and they're on to the next thing. The thing is that it looks like the approach by the green person is not as good, and they score less on the immediate exam, and so that's and what happens in problem-based learning is that you're not only learning about atherosclerosis, but you're also learning about approaching problems. And so on any immediate exam, you're going to score lower unless the exam's about how you approach problems, and it rarely is. And so in the Bjork's work around desirable difficulties, they did a simple thing, which is they tested people on an immediate exam just the way you would. But then they also tested people a month later. They let people forget. They let life happen after the learning, and then they looked at how good the learning was. And what they found was that if you learned in a desirable difficulty fashion, your immediate test score was lower, but because you had struggled with the material and you'd laid down good structures in your brain, you retain that material much better than somebody who superficially crammed for the test, scored high, but then a month later all of that stuff was gone because it was such superficial learning. In thinking about this, we can go further in that if I teach you how to learn up front, then independent of the forgetting phase, the hope would be that at some future point where you have to learn something new, that not only would you learn it, but you would learn it faster. So that so in a way, it's learning how to learn pays dividends on further down, irrespective of the content of the thing that you're learning. And so it's an argument for, again, thinking hard about the first phase of the learning curve. How am I going to teach you how to learn? And if I teach you how to learn well, then every single time you come up with a learning situation, you're going to have an advantage that will pay for the initial investment. And I like to compare it to compound interest. And so so initially problem-based learning or metacognitive approaches or a master adaptive learner approach or a desirable difficulty feels worse. So it feels worse than the easy path that you could have taken. But in learning how to learn and in paying that price, ultimately, interest begets interest, meaning that learning begets learning. And if you learn everything 5% better than you might otherwise have done, that 5% of 5% of 5% ultimately results in exponential learning as opposed to linear learning. And that's where you can do better. Okay, and the last phase of this is that learning counterintuitively is not necessarily about me. And what the idea is, and I'm sorry that I've shown you a lot of S-shaped curves. I'm going to show you another one, but the idea here is a bit different. In that pretend that this x-axis is the 4 years of medical school or nursing school. Then what tends to happen is that initially when we're learning, we need training wheels. We need to be scaffolded. We need to be supported and in the learning because there's so much to learn. And what we as instructors do is we adapt what is to be learned to the learner. We kind of spoon feed you. We cone down the world to a smaller, more manageable chunk, and we keep you in your zone of proximal development, sort of just enough to challenge you and to move you forward. But ultimately, as we fade those scaffolds, we take away the training wheels, or we make them smaller and smaller and smaller. I can't get you to win the Tour de France by taking away more and more training wheels. At a certain point, we have to pivot and we have to take away the training wheels, but we have to similarly get you on the mountain and get you throwing yourself against the real situation. And so halfway through the training system, the way I've got it portrayed here, we have to pivot from us adapting the learning to you to instead adapting you to the learning. And so that so it's a different mindset, and what it requires is for me to coach you and put you in the difficult situation, but then help you make sense of it and help you develop the muscles necessary and the attitudes and the aptitudes and the skills necessary to function well in a dangerous, difficult environment that is clinical care. So it gets to be less about you and more about the environment. And in health professions, we're blessed with having a great orienting North Star, which is the patient. And so by focusing on the patient and how you can best meet the needs of the patient allows us to take this on and adapt the learner to the learning. So we're not going to do this next slide now, but as an exercise at home, think about skills, important skills within your domain, and the way sort of way a training wheel mindset affects you in terms of creating a learning situation, and instead compare that to a coaching mindset and a way of putting the person in the difficult environment and then setting them up for success. And again, this is another advertisement for learning for adaptability, and so that putting the person in situations where they have to adapt and they have to innovate and they have to be creative is the way to develop adaptive experts, and that's part of what that coaching should do if we're to develop master adaptive learners. So again, I've gone through, some, kind of counterintuitive examples of how learning is different for a clinician and how we should adapt some of our learning structures within the health professions in order to better train learners for the long run. And so that's that key phase within the master adaptive learner model, and you can see why we emphasize it, and you can see also the conundrum of teaching clinicians how to learn when they've already been successful in many respects with regards to the learning. It's just taking it to the next level. I'm just going to touch briefly on the planning phase of the master adaptive learner cycle and then finish up. And so in the planning phase, that's how you enter the cycle. It's that you need to recognize that you need to learn. So again, it's that far left side of the learning curve where things aren't clear and you have to organize yourself around the learning. And there, what's important is having a questioning attitude, being alert to the signals in your environment that you could be learning, but also getting help perhaps in prioritizing what to learn. You can't learn it all. And in fact, that prioritizing muscle will be an important thing for you as a clinician, because when the teachers aren't around in an adaptive expertise kind of mindset, you need to be still able to prioritize what to get better at. And so in the planning phase, there are three main elements, and one, as I mentioned, is identifying a gap, and then amongst all the gaps that you'll identify, there's great research suggesting that there are many gaps in every practice setting. You need to prioritize those gaps as opportunities, and then having figured out what you're going to attend to, finding and appraising the resources is the important element of the next one. So in a world that has a fire hose of information, how do you figure out what's real and what's not, and move things forward, is increasingly not only going to be an important skill for you as an individual, it's going to be increasingly a more and more important part of you as a clinician, is that the value you add for the patient is allowing them to negotiate all the information that's out there and tailoring it to their particular problem, how you can help them the best. And so again, what I would stress is that the planning phase is that left-hand third of the learning curve. It's the part where it's not immediately intuitive exactly how you would proceed, and yet the decisions you make, like what am I going to attend to, how am I going to investigate it, how am I going to goal set, how will I know when I'm done, those elements at the far left will determine how successful you are in negotiating all of this learning curve. And jumping straight into the linear part of it, while that again, so that's that false sort of good feeling of learning, and I feel like I'm learning. But if you're feeling great about learning the wrong thing or the superficial thing, when the more difficult questions of professionalism or communication skills are really the thing that you should be learning, and not a series of multiple choice questions, kind of that's the sort of thing that we're talking about here in the planning phase. And so again, paying real attention to how you set things up, and in the next session we'll go over that, but how you recognize when you need when you have a problem, when how to attend that is really the important point and can set you up for success. So what I'd like to finish on in the next couple of slides is just again summarizing how we think differently about learning in an adaptive expertise context compared to traditional learning. And so that in traditional learning, we lay out well-known prototypes and we want you to be more like those. And so that whereas in adaptive expertise, what we're saying is that there are many contexts out there, and we want you to be able to develop an expertise that can match whatever the situation is that is presented. So it's about your match to the situation as opposed to just you. And in doing that, what we emphasize is not adapting the environment to the learner, but rather adapting the learner to the environment, how they can keep doing that more and more effectively. And this requires the learner to step out of their comfort zone, so that it's less about us creating a situation in which you're just learning it exactly the most efficient way, but instead saying that the world is difficult and here's how you manage that difficulty. And by the by, suggesting that the best learning can be difficult, and becoming comfortable with difficulty and struggle. The progression of learning is less in this model about withdrawing scaffolds and support, and more about progressively adding adaptive behaviors and adding to your flexible toolkit so that you can pull exactly the right method or conceptualization to approach the problem that's in front of you. And finally, instead of having an endpoint of learning, which is the full withdrawal of scaffolds, the full withdrawal of educational support, to suggesting that there is no endpoint, that ultimately that we can all get better at every time, and that the idea is to keep on getting better, and like a shark, that as soon as you stop, that you're in trouble, and so that it's more about having that attitude towards ever improving. And so even on this learning curve that I've been showing you, I shouldn't show it as being flattened out at the top, but rather like in the other ones, that there's a slope to it, that you're ever improving. And so in summary, I've presented phases 1 and 2 of the master adaptive learner model, the planning phase and the learning phase, and suggested their importance, not just in this process, but again, it's quite a claim that the group is making, but the claim is that a core part of the identity of a clinician is learning, and being able to learn, and being able to learn well, and that we need to master that, and that sometimes it's not straightforward, and that just doing it the way we've always been doing it isn't optimal, and that this kind of expertise is to be valued by each and every clinician. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in part 3, where we're going to take on the assessing and adjusting phases.